finally we have got some good news from Australia. Unions at Woodside Energy offshore gas platforms on Sunday announced plans to strike as early as September 2, which could eventually disrupt shipments of LNG from top global exporter Australia. The strike threat escalates a long-running dispute between Woodside and workers over pay and conditions on its Northwest Shelf gas platforms, which feed Australia's biggest LNG plant. Unions in Australia are required by law to give companies 7 working days notice before any industrial action, but can elect to call off any action before then. The Offshore Alliance, which combines the Maritime Union of Australia and Australian Workers' Union, said in a Facebook post it had unanimously endorsed giving Woodside 7 working days notice to strike if its bargaining claims are not met by close of business on Wednesday. That would mean a strike could start as soon as September 2. Woodside tried every tactic it could think of to avoid bargaining with its workers as a collective, but in the end the company failed to maintain the status quo. It liked one where what the company says goes, Offshore Alliance spokesperson said in a statement. Offshore Alliance members don't take industrial action lightly, but Woodside is really leaving them with little choice here. The Offshore Alliance also represents workers at Chevron's Gorgon and Wheatstone LNG facilities. Workers there on Friday began voting on whether to grant unions permission to call for strike action, with the first results due by Thursday. Woodside's and Chevron's facilities together supply about 10% of the global LNG market. Concerns about a strike have spurred volatility in European gas prices over fears the move would fuel competition between Asian and European buyers for cargoes. Is Europe headed for an energy catastrophe of its own making? Given the unrealistic push for solar and wind and the shutting down of nuclear plants, it would seem there is no plan. Germany is returning to coal power. Reporter Ralph Scholhammer joins us to explain this madness.
Well, is Europe headed for an energy catastrophe of its own making, shutting down nuclear power plants, making unrealistic push for wind and solar energy at the expense of fossil fuels and tried and true forms of energy, and friends that blow up their own pipelines and they totally ignore when friends blow up your pipelines, they look the other way. Amazing friends to have, actually. And now a foreign policy magazine out with an article with the headline, Europe's Worst Energy Nightmare is Becoming Reality. And of course, painting a picture that 2022, the winter of 2022, was never going to really be the damaging winter. It was always going to be the winter of 2023 into 2024. Someone who follows the story very closely is academic researcher and good friend of the show, Ralph Scholhammer, and he's back with us. Ralph, good to see you.
Fantastic to be back on, Clay. Great to be with you.
Well, there's a lot of moving parts in Europe, but it seems like Europe is hell-bent on shooting itself in the foot. They know, I mean, we've been reporting here on the show for about 6, 7, 8 months now about the winter of discontent being this winter, 2023, the energy catastrophe that could unfold in Europe. And Europe's been well aware of it, but they seem hell-bent on not doing anything about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you mentioned, what we saw last winter, it looks like the Europeans are now confusing good fortune with good strategy. And there's now this idea that the last winter was not as bad as it could have been because of some fantastic decisions that have been made. But it was just luck. You were right? The true fear was always this winter, not the last one. Although the last one could have been a problem if it would have been a really cold winter, but it was an extraordinarily warm winter. Now, based on the weather patterns we know, we had an El Nino event this summer. This is one of the reasons why actually temperatures have also been so hot this summer. But that very often, statistically at least, is followed by a dry and cold winter. So this winter could actually be a really cold winter. And preparations, that is absolutely correct, are not where they're supposed to be to avoid yet another, maybe not catastrophe, but definitely crisis, meaning yet another 1.2 trillion potentially dollars that need to be spent to make it through the winter. And that is not a recipe you can repeat endlessly. At some point, this is going to cause real havoc on the political and economic systems in Europe.
And we see, of course, policies across these different countries really affecting industry. We've seen, watching Germany very closely. I mean, just describe to our audience what's been happening to German industry and manufacturing because of energy problems.
Yeah, I mean, I have some good and bad news here. One is, if you go back and you look at the conversation around energy 10 years ago, everybody took Germany as the role model, right? Everybody wanted to do what the Germans did. Now Germany is gradually becoming an outlier because slowly but surely, it's like an ocean liner that tries to change course. but slowly but surely more and more countries are realigning themselves with reality. We mentioned in a conversation before the show, right, that Sweden is making a change in their energy course. Norway, right, has now approved another $18 billion in oil and gas exploration. Even Denmark, the renewables wunderkind with all their wind energy, has now said, well, we'd like to look for a little bit more oil and gas in the North Sea. The United Kingdom is basically making a U-turn in their energy policy. So it's kind of Germany is still holding back. They kind of have ideologically locked themselves so much in their policies that it will take longer, which is a problem because, as you correctly mentioned, they are Europe's largest economy. So if they do it slower, it's going to hold everybody else back as well. But I have some cautious optimism that there is a realignment with reality. The question is, how much pain will Europeans have to experience, and what will be the political consequences of that pain from where we are now to the actual realignment with reality?
Do you think that there's an admission that this has failed? This idea that we're going to all live off of wind energy, that we're all going to live off of solar, and that now there's a dawning in Europe saying we can't. We need nuclear power. We need to go back to the things that got us here. But you have these environmentalists getting in the way. You have environmental groups saying, no, you want to open up 8 new nuclear power plants, but we're going to get in the way and tell you why you shouldn't do it.
I mean, as you just mentioned, right, if we hope that anybody is openly admitting, like, we made a mistake, we're still waiting for this in the COVID policies. We're still waiting on this in the
Right.
Russia policy. We're still waiting on this in central bank policies. What will happen is that in 2-3 years, everybody will always have been for nuclear, and everybody will always have known that the energy transition doesn't work, right? It's just as we see with COVID, like, all of a sudden, nobody remembers that they were for mandatory masks and lockdowns. And this is exactly the same thing here. So everybody all of a sudden will always have known what reality was like. But to be quite honest, for now, if somehow they adapt their policies to where they should be, I'm satisfied for the moment. But I think politically there should be at some point some accountability. You mentioned it also before, but whether it's Nord Stream 2 and other things, there is this idea that in government nobody is ever held accountable. And this is really a problem because they make mistake after mistake after mistake. And until they correct it, average people, normal people have to suffer the consequences. And it would be nice if they would get it right from the start for a change.
There's been very little natural gas exploration in Europe, the story that we've covered closely here on this show, and of course, much reliance on Russia's natural gas and natural gas pipelines and resources coming from Russia. And if Russia pulls back on its natural gas exports, you have oil being pulled back as well. How devastating would that be for Europe to have that tap controlled by Russia and not be able to get the amount that they need in order to support industry and just basic heating of homes?
Oh yeah, no, it is a huge problem, and as you just mentioned, right? I mean, there is still plenty of resources in all areas from Russia reaching Europe, so that tap has not yet been fully closed. But instead of preparing themselves for it, right, Europeans are still hesitant. Europe is very, very slow in securing long-term LNG contracts. They are very, very slow to begin mining in Europe, to begin fracking in Europe, which of course has, where it's happening, some negative consequences on the environment. But of course, the question is, isn't that a price one should be willing to pay in order to save, let's say, your economy and by extension, your democracy? I mean, Europeans accept that there's fracking in the United States, right? We accept that there is mining in Chile, but apparently our nature is supposed to stay pristine without ever being touched. You can do this, but if you want to live without industry, you're also going to have the living standards as they would be, right, in pre-industrial times. And I think this is something most Europeans are not willing to sign up to.
Do you see, I mean, we see some positive moves, as you pointed out. And so I want to, I love the positivity here. I don't want to, be negative. So that's great. We see some of these countries now really turning towards nuclear, pushing for more oil and natural gas exploration. It seems to be an awareness that they went a little too far on these renewables, on this renewables plan. Do you see an opportunity now for these governments, the European Union, to really pull back more broadly on these policies? Because a lot of these things are set in stone. We saw the King of England, for crying out loud, set up a doomsday clock. So it seems like we've got some movement towards positivity, and you have yet this sort of doomsday scenario, this doomsday clock being set up in Europe as well. But do you see them sort of really rolling back in a big, big way, this sort of net zero kind of boondoggle?
Not yet, but if we kind of stay with our more optimistic theme for a change today, you see that more and more commentators and like the Telegraph, like other media who didn't do it like 5 or 6 years back, that they start to actually mock these things, right? The doomsday clock. There are actually more and more people who say, listen, people, this is ridiculous. Right? I mean, this idea the world is going to end in what, like 20, like in 6 years, if we don't pretty much halt all oil and gas exploration. So more and more people, I think, see the ridiculousness of it. It's a slow process, but it's one that's happening. Now, the question will be, I always think, it's like we are in like the D-Day scenario now. There are those who kind of dug in, in the forts along the coast and say net zero at any cost. And there are those, I say, that try to, if you allow the comparison, try to storm the beaches and say this is a suicidal policy. It's kind of, at the moment, we don't know how this battle is going to end. But I think as long as, and this is another topic that you have dealt with a great deal, is as long as we can get the information out, as long as shows like yours can be online, I think that pushback is going to get stronger. What I'm more afraid of, almost as the actual net zero policies, will be a push to kind of put under punishment anybody who criticizes it, because there is a tendency to do this, right? There's a tendency, all of a sudden, you are only saying that maybe solar in Northern Europe doesn't work. It almost makes you a climate denier, and climate deniers are a danger. Therefore, they should be silenced. So this is going to be the kind of pushback I'm particularly worried about. That as more and more people realize that these policies are misguided, instead of changing policies, some governments will say, "Oh, we're just going to ban the debate on it." So this is kind of the more pessimistic outlook I have on this.
I'll get you out of here, and there's something you've been following very closely, which is the farmers. And of course, a byproduct of all of this craziness has been farmers being pushed out of their land, the sort of land grabs and eminent domain grabs by governments because of nitrogen laws and other things like that. Do you think that we're going to see a reversal, a shift? We've certainly seen some political upheaval in the Netherlands as a result of it, where this may not come to fruition the way that we thought it might. Are you going to see? Do you think we're going to see a larger pushback on this in support of farmers and farmers' rights throughout most of Europe?
I do hope so, although I have to admit, and we had a conversation about this in the past, I'm starting to become more and more disillusioned with the farmer citizens movement in the Netherlands, the BBB. I think they had really an opportunity to kind of be, the tip of the spear in this struggle in defense of the farmers, but I think they're getting more and more wobbly and weaker in kind of standing for their principles. I think this is going to be a huge disappointment. I am, as I said before, right, there are some countries who move back. Agriculture will be the next big thing, because those who are fighting against oil and gas, they already have agriculture high up on the list. And I think it's up then to us again to point out the one basic thing: without agriculture and without energy, you cannot live a modern life, right? You cannot have access to modern medicine. You cannot not have access to modern transportation. You cannot have access to anything that makes life, in very modest circumstances, a comfortable life. And I think this is really something where the kind of realization of this needs to be made clearer. But many of the movements that started so promising, they then, I don't know if they're afraid of their own courage. It's hard to say. Maybe they have been not kind of bought in the traditional sense, but that the temptation of partaking in the existing institutions and the existing political framework and getting access to funds and money is just so strong that you throw your ideals overboard and say, at least for me, now my life is made. I don't know. It's a combination of all of this, but many of the movements sometimes turn out to be very, very disappointing. I mean, we'll see with the Tories in the United Kingdom. Will they really change course? Or is it just kind of they pretend to go to the right on the issues, and then as soon as there are elections or as soon as they can do something, they go back to the left? We'll see how that is going to play out.
Actually, I said I was going to get you out of here on the last question. I'll get you out on this question, which is, if we have a severe winter throughout Europe, a much colder winter as a result of the dry temperatures and so forth that we talked about, is Europe prepared to handle it? Do we have enough? Do we have enough supplies? Do we have enough coal? Do we have enough power? Do we have enough natural gas? Do we have enough oil? Do we have enough heating oil to be able to be prepared all across Europe for a really devastating winter?
Well, let's put it this way. Do we have enough to keep everything running? No. do we have enough to keep homes heated but turn off whatever remains of industry? Then the answer is yes. And this is what's going to happen, right? If you look at the last winter, one of the major factors, what they call it kind of euphemistically, energy savings or demand destruction. If we are honest, it was industry destruction, right? You close down your industry, you close down furnaces, you close down all these areas where you need industrial heat, and then you can use these resources to heat domestic homes. But the problem is, once the winter is over, the people in those homes, they might fight themselves out of a job. And that's the issue. So am I terrified of people freezing to death in their homes or permanent blackouts, right? Maybe rolling blackouts depending on the winter, yes. But the main scenario is that one such winter, and it's really questionable what's going to be left of industry.
Right. And we had a very mild winter last year, and we saw a number of industries close as a result. So imagine the scenario when it's much worse and these industries cannot stay open. So that's as a quick last point, right? Wherever one stands on these issues, deindustrialization is a fact, right? Every statistic shows this, like every number shows this. Manufacturing, outsourcing of production, companies moving. It's not just Germany, like deindustrialization is happening. And the two things that every company mentions is regulations and energy costs. So we know what the problem is. The question is, at what point will government say, as we said earlier, okay, you know what, this was an ideological program. The ideology does not line up at all with reality, so we have to change it. Or will they say, to hell with industry, to hell with growth, to hell with prosperity, as long as we quote unquote do something to maybe save a little bit of the planet? We'll see what the outcome is ultimately going to be. Yeah, excellent point. Deindustrialization is happening right before our eyes. And we will see what happens this winter. Ralf Schulhammer, thank you so much for joining us, as always, with your expertise and insight on all things energy policy throughout Europe. We really appreciate it, as always. Thanks, Ralf.
Thank you so much for having me.
Don't forget to smash the like button and turn on your notifications bell if you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one.